Hi, I'm Cody Sanders, joining you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm talking with you today about the topic of apocalyptic emotions. COVID-19 is most undoubtedly the most disruptive global event in history in our lifetimes, but it is not happening in isolation. I want to give you a picture of the broader context that we are living and dying through right now. In 2018, the doomsday clock, kept by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, was moved to 100 seconds till midnight. This was moved over the existential threats of potential nuclear war, of catastrophic effects of climate change. And for the first time, the bulletin moved the clock, giving attention to the cyber-enabled information warfare that makes it difficult for societies and governments to respond to the first two threats. A year prior to this, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report citing 6,000 scientific references, alerting the world that we have only until 2030, 10 years from this time, to take drastic action to reduce CO2 levels by 45% in order to avert irreversible climate-driven disaster, which would require rapid and far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of our society. We watched wildfires burn through the continent of Australia, destroying 27.2 million acres of bush and forest and park. Months later, one of the Earth's coldest regions of Siberia faced fires that raged across a landscape that was typically frozen. And in our own context in the US, we watched the West Coast burn with wildfire. When the COVID-19 pandemic emerged, we witnessed the faltering of industrial sectors in one location of the world affect supply chains and resource availabilities across the world. The social and the political rifting in the US developed into an ideological battle over wearing protective face coverings, and racial disparities determined which communities were most adversely affected by the virus. Then the entire world watched as Minneapolis police killed an unarmed black man named George Floyd in front of cell phone cameras and a crowd of his neighbors pleading for the police to relent after their 8 minutes and 46 seconds with their knee in Floyd's neck as he lay on the ground dying. The country erupted into protests over police violence and the continued killing of unarmed black people, even as white supremacists infiltrated protests in order to sow violence. Hospitals couldn't keep enough PPE on hand to keep staff protected while treating COVID patients, while police had an unending supply of tear gas, rubber bullets, and militarized riot gear to turn against protesters. Federal agents with the Department of Homeland Security wearing camouflage and driving unmarked vans arrested protesters on the streets of Portland, Oregon, and even collected and analyzed information from the social media accounts of protesters. Now take a moment to notice how you feel after hearing some of the events of the last couple of years compressed into this brief description. If you're listening to this lecture with a group of others, perhaps in a classroom, you might even pause here for a few minutes to talk with one or two other people about how each of these events landed for you and when they first occurred, or for your community when you first learned about each of these occurrences. How did they impact the communities you belong to? What were the emotions that emerged for you and for your communities? Emotions are vital for us as human beings. They constitute our motivational system, serving as signals to us and how to interpret the moment we are living through. They influence our attention, our memory, our goals, our priorities, and it is impossible to separate emotions from cognitive thought. Emotions, cognition, intuition all operate in an integrated fashion. What I want to talk with you today about first are what I'm calling apocalyptic emotions. Apocalyptic emotions occur in times that are filled with various kinds of endings. It may not be the end of the world, but it may feel like the end of the world as we know it. And the three emotions I want to focus some attention on here are fear, anger, and sadness. These are not the only emotions that occur in times like the ones that I've been describing, but they are ones that I imagine came up for you when you discussed this context: the movement of the doomsday clock, the IPCC report, the circumstances of the pandemic, the killing of George Floyd. Each of these three, fear, anger, and sadness, are usually named among human beings' primary emotions that occur at a subcortical level, that is below the higher reasoning neocortex. And I want to say up front that as we explore these emotions as they arise in times that feel apocalyptic, the objective is never to diminish their importance or to try to diminish their capacity for influencing us or our capacity for feeling them. These emotions are a part of our evolutionary inheritance and our sacred embodiment, and they serve an important function for our survival and well-being. These emotions are vitally important to us as human beings. But left unattended and triggered with great frequency, as is in the case in our current era and in a society that is inundated with a 24-hour news cycle and social media saturation, these emotions can also come to exacerbate our apocalyptic circumstances and our suffering. This is especially the case when the emotions of fear, anger, and sadness move from being emotions, which occur typically in seconds or minutes, and shift into becoming moods, which last for days or weeks, and then develop into even longer lasting temperaments or outlooks on life or orientations to the world, toward which we are acting and responding through these emotional lenses of fear and anger and sadness. The aim of this exploration is to help caregivers and leaders in faith communities to attend carefully to these emotions in order to cultivate adaptation and flourishing in times when the world feels like it is on the brink. I want to first talk with you about the emotion of fear. Emotions carry a message. They are signals to us about something that is going on in our environment. And the message of fear is danger. Typically, the danger is one arising as a concrete threat to our physical harm in our immediate present. Now, this is this is different from anxiety, which is a related emotion to fear, but anxiety occurs in circumstances that are a bit more ambiguous, where the threat of danger isn't quite so palpable and clear. I'm focusing here on fear because in the context that we are living and dying through, the dangers posed are quite palpable, quite immediate, and real. The dangers posed to Black bodies by police is not ambiguous. The threat of police killing is very real and is being played out in front of our eyes. The racialized bodies that we move about with in the world affect just how relative that fear becomes to us. So a white body may never experience the palpable immediacy of fear from watching the Floyd killing on video or from having the memory of that kind of fear brought about immediately back to us when we encounter a police officer on the street. Apocalyptic emotions are relativized by our racial embodiment. And that's an aspect that I want us to be particularly attentive to throughout this talk. And again, climate change poses genuine, immediate, and growing threats to our lives and well-being that are being played out day by day. The threat is no longer in the far future. We wake up to the scenes of climate-driven disaster every day. If not in our own backyards, then on the news, portrayed in some part of our country or our world. Our geographic locations have often buffered our feeling, the immediacy of these fears of climate-driven disaster, but they are now becoming more palpable to us through extreme weather events that are happening all over the world. And now, as the pandemic devolves economies into the worst recession since World War II, fears of layoffs, fears of eviction, of homelessness, of loss of health insurance are immediate and unambiguous dangers to many. Our economic positions make us more or less susceptible to the immediacy of fear in relation to economic collapse. The stock market dipping may cause some a sense of anxiety, while sudden layoffs or loss of insurance or impending eviction may stimulate immediate fear in relation to the well-being of others. There are many reasons that fear is triggered in times that feel apocalyptic. And a key question in exploring the presence of fear when it arises is this: how am I perceiving my well-being or the well-being of my wider world of concern being put in danger right now? This is an important question to reckon with when you feel fear emerging in these times that feel apocalyptic. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what happens when each of these emotions become elongated into temperaments or outlooks on life. When fear becomes constitutive of our outlook on life, when it becomes the dominant emotional valence of our approach to the world, it creates an erosion of trust in others. It can create a decreased sense of security, a sense of helplessness. It can lead to giving in to apathy, and it can cause a sense of immobilization in the face of very real dangers that we face in our day-to-day lives. Now, we know in the biblical tradition there is this admonition, do not fear, that arises over and over again. I want to help you to see that biblical admonition in a bit of a different light. I want to invite you to hear that as something like, do not let fear consume you. Do not let the fearful experiences of life sever your connection to others and to the world around you. Do not let fear immobilize you. Robert Fuller notes that perceiving threats to our cultural boundaries can provoke fear responses that are widely communicated and serve to heighten loyalty and conformity. Now, this is particularly important as we give attention to the political landscape of our lives. Fear can be drawn upon in this way to protect one's sense of culture, one's way of life, and most notably one's privilege. We can see fear triggered and exacerbated by white supremacist groups as well as conspiracy theory circles like QAnon. And fear is a prevalent emotion used for political purposes to motivate behavior. Resmaa Menakem reminds us our bodies don't care about logic, truth, or cognitive experience. He says they care about safety and survival. They care about responding to a perceived threat, even when that threat is not real. So very importantly here, even when you are working with someone who is feeling fear in relation to something that you believe is not real, for example, a conspiracy theory, that doesn't mean that that emotion of fear isn't really powerfully affecting their outlook on life and their way of experiencing life and the world. So even if the sort of focus of that fear and danger isn't real, it is affecting our bodily experience in some very particular ways. So here's another note I want to make as we move forward. We are all dealing with the reality of digital emotional contagion when we're addressing these apocalyptic emotions. Emotional contagion describes the phenomenon through which our emotions, either consciously or unconsciously, become more similar to the emotions we perceive in others as we are exposed to their emotion. Now, digitally, this takes place through the spread of our emotions on the internet, especially through social media. Constant exposure to the emotions of others particularly around their emotions of fear and anger and sadness, whether in person or in the digital realm, can lead us to experience many of those stresses associated with these emotions, even if we caught the emotions from others. Let's move on a bit, just to note this, this book that I mentioned earlier, My Grandmother's Hands. This is a particularly helpful book when dealing with fear, and a book that is really approachable and useful in congregational and faith community contexts. I'd recommend you take a look at this book if you are able. And then moving on to anger a bit, the second apocalyptic emotion. Fear and anger are related and interdependent emotions. Both emotions have the primary objective of survival. They also have very similar biochemical components to them. So much of what I explored with you earlier in relation to fear also applies to anger. And I want to note up front how our approaches to anger are particularly racialized. Bell Hooks says, to perpetuate and maintain white supremacy, white folks have colonized Black Americans, and a part of that colonizing process has been teaching us to repress our rage, to never make them the targets of any anger we feel about racism. A really good example of the ways that anger is allowed and invited and honored differently among white people and persons of color, particularly Black people in the US, are the examples of, for instance, the Michigan state capitol protests around the beginning of the pandemic when stay-at-home orders were issued, and white men clad in camouflage, military gear, assault-style weapons came to the Capitol. And eventually were allowed to go into the balcony areas of the Senate and even yell down at lawmakers about their anger over the government's approach to the pandemic. Contrast this to, for example, Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of George Floyd's killing, when Black and brown persons and many white persons as well entered the streets of many cities, and unarmed, typically quite peaceful protests in many instances, were met with militarized police force. This is helping us see a bit what Bell Hooks is noting here about the colonization of Black emotions, particularly the Black emotion of anger. Our racialized embodiment really influences how we are able to experience and express these emotions. Now, Lazarus says that the message of anger is a demeaning offense against me and mine. So it's easy to see how this emotion also becomes politicized, stoking resentment and deepening divides among people. And a key question when dealing with anger as it emerges for our communities in the midst of times that feel apocalyptic is a key question is this: how do I perceive my values being threatened? Now, these may be values of justice or survival or well-being or flourishing, and they are values of my own survival and well-being, but also the survival and well-being of my community. That may be my local community, my community of affinity around race or sexuality or gender. Maybe my community of earth creatures, of the larger web of life being threatened by climate-driven disaster and things of that nature. This could be a good time also to stop and talk about how you are experiencing these threats in your own communities at this point, if you have a few minutes to do that. Now, as a temperament or outlook, if anger is elongated into that type of orientation toward life, the emotion evolves into a sense of bitterness, of resentment. You can hear that quite clearly in many of our political discussions today. It can emerge into hostility and hatred. It can emerge into a pervasive sense of cynicism, of contempt, to a very dichotomized us-them thinking, and even into vengefulness against those who pose this offense or threat against my deeply held sense of values. I want to note two books that I think you would find useful. One, The Angry Christian by Andrew Lester, is particularly helpful for pastors, for pastoral care specialists, for faith community leaders. This is a really nuanced approach from a narrative theoretical perspective on anger and the Christian tradition. And the second, by Rod Owens, Love and Rage, is a really great book to use in context of book discussions, laity discussions, things of that nature. And Owens comes from a Buddhist perspective on anger and rage, and a particularly justice-oriented focus on the emotion. I recommend both of these books to you if you have the time to look into them. Now, moving on a bit to the third apocalyptic emotion, sadness. The message of sadness is that something is being lost. And importantly, rather than motivating fight or flight like anger and fear do, sadness moves us toward resignation. Again, this is an emotion that has particular racial implications as well. You may be familiar with Claudia Rankine and her powerful essay, The Condition of Black Life is One of Mourning. This comes from a time when Rankine asked one of her friends what it's like being the mother of a Black son. And Rankine's friend replied, "The condition of Black life is one of mourning." Liberal white people, Rankine says, can feel temporarily bad about Black suffering, but, she says, no mode of empathy can replicate the daily strain of knowing that as a Black person you can be killed for simply being Black. A key question here when addressing sadness is what important parts of my world feel like they are being lost or irreparably damaged? Again, this could be a good place to stop and discuss this among your co-learners here. Now, when sadness is elongated into a temperament or an outlook, beyond that initial moment when it alerts us to the fact that something is being lost, and it becomes how we are oriented toward the world, sadness can lead to a loss of meaning or a pervasive sense of despair, or the feeling of absolute helplessness. It can also eventuate in emotional numbness or extreme fatigue or withdrawal from others and from community. These are all particularly important to attend to when you see them arising in the communities you serve. And noting the ways through these questions that I'm offering you, noting the ways that sadness or anger or fear are influencing your perspectives and outlooks and orientations to life is helpful to bring those emotions from their subcortical stimuli into a more prefrontal cortex realm of rationally discussing and deciding on how these emotions need to influence and inform our perspectives and outlooks on life and our motivations in relation to those emotions. But beyond the care provided for communities experiencing these apocalyptic emotions, I want to help you think through possibilities for cultivating more complex emotional experiences that will serve as emotional resources toward flourishing in times that feel apocalyptic. And I'm calling these here transimminent emotions. And what I mean here is that these emotions are both ones that carry an aspect of transcendence. That is, they open us toward the world beyond our individual self. That could be transcendence toward others in our communities, toward the larger, more than human web of life, or transcendence toward the divine or a sense of ultimacy. but they also contain a particularly palpable sense of immanence. That is, they help us to relate differently to the human and the more than human world that is immediately present to us in our context. So rather than the kind of fight or flight or resignation movements that the apocalyptic emotions invite, these transimmanent emotional experiences invite engagement. They invite relationship. They invite exploration of life in the world in more complex ways. Now, there are three that I want to talk about, though there are others that you will no doubt think about as well. And the three I want to cover are wonder, grief, and gratitude. So let's look at what they potentially do here. These transimmanent emotions, hopefully as they're cultivated in community, help us to subvert the potential for our dominant storyline to become shaped by fear and anger and sadness. They do not keep us from experiencing fear, anger, and sadness. They ideally help us not to allow fear, anger, and sadness to become our dominant orientation toward life in the world. And they shape our emotional experiences and plot lines toward the flourishing and livability of life. Again, the aim is not to cut us off from the messages of the apocalyptic emotions, but to cultivate motivational pathways like community and generosity and compassion and love and a struggle toward justice and flourishing. There are three that I want to cover with you now. The first is that of wonder. Wonder is an emotional experience that helps us to suspend our habitual ways of looking at the world. It lures us into creative connection with our environment. You might think about the last time you experienced a palpable sense of awe or astonishment that prompted you to consider life from new perspectives, that opened up pathways for you to explore other ways of seeing the world than the one in which you are entrenched. Wonder entices us into relational aspects of reality. So this is very important when we kind of put this into conversation with those emotional experiences that often serve to distance us from others. Wonder invites us into relationship with others. And not only human others, but also more than human aspects of the larger web of life. Wonder moves us beyond self-interest into acts of love and empathy and compassion and the preservation of life. Martha Nussbaum talks about wonder as being at the core of our experience of compassion and our ability to act toward others in ways that do not serve our own self-interests, but that actually enhance the livability of life for the other. And it leads us into experiences of curiosity and creativity and exploration and innovation and invention and adaptation. And a question that I want you to grapple with here in relation to wonder is, what does wonder feel like in a multisensory way? What does wonder taste like? What does wonder feel like in your body? What does it look like or smell like or sound like? And what connection to others does wonder invite for you? Two experiences that invite wonder for me are the experiences of walking in the midst of really deep woods. This is a picture of Muir Woods, one of my favorite places when I lived in Northern California. Walking amidst trees that have preceded you by generations and will outlast you for generations can provoke that experience of awe that invites us into relationality with the wider web of life in a different way. Also, just the sense of looking at the moon and recognizing that every creature that has ever lived on the earth and that will ever live on the earth has looked at and reflected on their life in relation to this object in the sky. A good book that I recommend for you if you want to explore more about wonder is this one by Robert Fuller called Wonder: From Emotion to Spirituality. Now, moving on a bit from wonder, I want to talk about gratitude. which is related to wonder in some ways. Diana Butler Bass says that that gratitude is basically an emotional response to the surprise of our very existence. And it is a particularly helpful emotion to cultivate that runs counter to the ingratitude and dissatisfaction that is ingrained into our economic system that propels our continual desires and cravings. Gratitude is an outward focusing emotion that orients us toward relationship and connection with the transcendent. That can be the transcendent within our relationality with the more than human world, or the transcendent in relationship to the divine, or a sense of ultimacy. Really importantly, many of the emotional experiences cultivated by our neoliberal capitalistic society are emotions that move us away from gratitude into desires and cravings and wants and dissatisfactions. And cultivating gratitude within community is a way of cultivating the emotional ability to respond counter to those larger forces of economic and political destruction. So here I want to note finally with gratitude that the ideals not only of capitalism but also of white supremacy often make gratitude a difficult emotion for white people to fully experience and engage with. There is this sense of meritocracy, that we have earned what is ours, and that leaning into those experiences of resources or things of that nature with too much gratitude calls into question what we have actually earned and what we have been given, or what we have taken that isn't ours. So there's a particular kind of criticality to the emotion of gratitude that we don't often recognize when we talk about being grateful for what we have. And two books that I think that would be really helpful, I'll note in a few minutes. But before that, let me get to this piece. One of the emotional experiences of gratitude that I have experienced really palpably in my communal work and life, and one that I really miss right now during a period of social distancing, is that of singing in a congregation that is giving voice to a sense of gratitude for the gifts of life and the gifts of community, the gifts that transcend our individual sense of self-sufficiency and things of that nature. You might stop to think about other ways that your community has cultivated the emotion of gratitude, not just noticed it, but actually cultivated the ability to feel deeply this relationality toward the gifts of life that do not belong to you, but that benefit you and your life and flourishing. And I point you to these two books. Diana Butler Bass's book, Grateful, is really helpful to use in book discussions. And one that is a little less known that Butler Bass actually draws upon, that I find really helpful for enlivening theological thinking around gratitude and its relationship to justice, is Radical Gratitude by Catholic theologian Mary Jo Leddy. Now, as we move toward the end of these transiminate emotions, I want to spend a few minutes on grief. So this should note for you that we are not kind of trying to move toward this more optimistic way of thinking, that, you know, gratitude and wonder may lead you to believe that I'm kind of moving away from these difficult emotions of fear, anger, and sadness into more happy and feel-good emotions. But some of these transeminent emotions really deal differently with the difficulties of life than the primary emotions of fear, anger, and sadness, and grief is one of them. It is not a kind of optimistic, happy emotion, but it is a more complex way for people in community to address their sense of loss. It moves us towards others in response to profound loss, rather than causing a sense of withdrawal from others in response to that loss. Grief is connected to the biblical resource of lament, which I think has been described so beautifully by Fred Craddock as a voice of love and profound caring, a vision for what could have been and grief over its loss, painfully releasing the object of one's hope, sorrow, and anger. Sadness moves us in the direction of resignation. Grief moves us in the direction of relationship with others, but it stays with those senses of sadness and anger and loss and impending losses, but puts us into meaningful activity with others, oftentimes very ritualized activity with others in relation to those losses. So questions we might want to address within our communities is, what losses do we need to more deeply mourn and lament and grieve together? And who are the others, both human and more than human, with whom we need to share in this work of grief? This could be our congregation or our faith community. It could be other congregations and faith communities. But I wonder if you can kind of think about an even larger community with which you might grieve, that includes aspects of the more than human world around you, trees and bodies of water and animals that are included in this community of grief and mourning and lament over the losses and impending losses of what feels profoundly important to us in our ecological contexts. A couple of other ways that we express grief in a more complex way with others is in protests. This is a protest or a demonstration, a witness, a public witness that my congregation held on the morning of George Floyd's funeral. Each person in this picture is holding a sign with the name of a Black person who has been killed by the police in the last couple of years. And then, we might think of a couple of years ago when our nation's airports became the site of protest around the first Muslim ban that was instituted, when hundreds of people showed up, not only to express anger, but also to embody the grief that this is where we are in our life as a country. Protests can be especially helpful to think about as sites of communal grieving. So as we close, I want to just note a few things that I think are important for you as faith community leaders to think about and to practice in relation to these apocalyptic emotions and the transcendent emotional experiences as well. First, I want to really clearly state again that we must honor the role of fear and anger and sadness as evolutionary gifts of our embodied experience. We have those emotional capacities for a reason. They are important to us. These are also a vital part of our creation and the imago Dei, the image of God. They help individuals and communities to listen to the embodied voices of these apocalyptic emotions and learn what they tell us about our deepest values and most intimate connections, and how we are to honor the role of these in our lives. Honoring the role of fear, sadness, and anger as important sources of knowledge for us, while keeping them from overtaking our experience of life in the world in ways that operate outside of our conscious awareness. So talking about these emotions brings them out of the subcortical region and the influences of the kind of subconscious and into this prefrontal cortex, where we can make decisions about how we relate to these emotions and what these emotions are saying to us about our lives and our values. So if you haven't heard it before, hear this: feeling fear, anger, and sadness in relation to the many endings that we are facing at this moment in our common human experience is normal, it is to be expected, it is necessary. But allowing fear, anger, and sadness to develop into long-lasting temperaments and orientations towards life exacerbates our experience of endings and can cut us off from adaptive movement toward flourishing, even flourishing at the end of the world as we know it. Second, caregivers in our communities must turn toward developing multisensory, embodied ways to cultivate these transimmanent emotional experiences. We can't simply explore the emotions of anger and fear and sadness ad nauseum, nor can we meet the affects of apocalypse with thinking about apocalypse alone. We must engage in the cultivation of more complex, communally oriented transimmanent emotions like wonder and gratitude and grief. So that when we come to the task of creating liturgy or ritual, we can be attentive to the affective dimensions that they aim to cultivate in participants just as much as we are attentive to the theological content they bear. When we gather in community, we can gather in ways that aim toward collective emotional engagement in wonder and gratitude and grief, as much as we focus on the content of our discussions and deliberations over the political climate or the actual climate or whatever else we might get together and discuss on a regular basis. When we verbally process our experiences of life in the midst of so many endings, facilitators like you can help participants to attend to the embodiment of their emotional experiences, how these emotional experiences feel in our bodies, as much as the rational deliberation by inviting reflection on the experiences of wonder and grief and gratitude with those questions that I asked before about how they feel and taste and smell, how you sense them with the fullness of your embodied experience in the world. In an apocalyptic era, the task of leading people into experiences of transimmanence must remain critical for us. It can seem like a secondary task, as if we are looking at this as a form of self-care, but I see this as actually quite critical to the primary task of moving our communities toward acts of compassion and peace and justice and addressing the structural ills that cause violence and the diminishment of life for various communities. So to close, I just want to say that life as we know it is coming to an end. It isn't the first ending that the world has ever faced, and it won't be the last ending that we face. With all there is to think about and all that there is that calls upon us to do and act in the world, we must also learn to feel our way through this apocalypse. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your good work with your communities. It's been good to be with you today.